You ever notice how some moments don't feel big when they happen, but looking back, they split your life in two? For me, it was a weekend bag, a small faded purple duffel with one broken zipper and my name written in Sharpie on the tag. Mom handed it to me on a Friday afternoon when the air smelled like cut grass and car exhaust. She said, "You're just gonna stay with them for a little while, sweetie." But the bag she packed told a different story. It wasn't a sleepover bag. It was a goodbye bag. "Hi, my name's Jenna Hartley. I'm 25 now. I run a nonprofit that teaches life skills to teens aging out of the foster care system. But I didn't get here because someone paved the way. I got here because at 12, the people who were supposed to love me most let me go. And not in a tearful, tragic way you see in movies. No. My parents dropped me off at someone else's doorstep, hugged me like they were mailing a letter, and never looked back. They left to travel the world with my younger sister, said they needed freedom to reset their lives. This story isn't about revenge, it's about reality. It's about what happens when your roots are cut, but you grow anyway, stronger, deeper, and in a direction they never expected. In the next few minutes, I'll take you through the years I spent building a life out of broken pieces. The foster parents who showed me what real care feels like. The social media post that shattered the last of my illusions. And the moment years later when my parents tried to come back into my life. But by then, I wasn't the girl with the duffel bag anymore. I was the one holding the door. So let's begin. Not with the pain, but with the strength that followed it. Because if you've ever felt unwanted, overlooked, or left behind, this story is for you. When you're 12, the world still feels soft. You believe what people say. You trust the tone in their voice more than the words themselves. So when my mom said, "You're just going to stay with them for a little while," I believed her. I nodded, clutching the handles of the weekend bag she'd packed for me. Old jeans, 2 t-shirts, a toothbrush, and my favorite book with the spine cracked from reading it too many times. I didn't notice until later that there were no pajamas, no school supplies, no return plan. The air was unusually quiet that morning. No one mentioned my sister Maxine, who stayed home and waved at me through the screen door like I was heading to summer camp. No one asked if I wanted to bring anything else. They just loaded me into the back seat and drove in silence, radio off, eyes forward. Looking back, the clues were all there. Mom avoiding my gaze, Dad's too cheerful tone, and that duffel bag packed like I'd been erased, not relocated. The Miller's house wasn't far, just a 20-minute drive, but it felt like another planet. Their porch was decorated with wind chimes and a bench that had actual cushions. It smelled like lavender and wood polish. Mrs. Miller smiled with the kind of kindness that felt practiced but hopeful. I remember thinking, how do you walk into someone else's life like you belong there? I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. Just stood there with my temporary bag waiting for someone to change their mind and say, "Just kidding, let's go home." But no one did. What I learned that day wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle, the kind of lesson that creeps into your bones. When people say temporary to make you feel safe, it often means they're not brave enough to tell you it's permanent. That bag wasn't packed for a visit, it was packed for a goodbye. But here's the thing, beginnings don't always look like beginnings. Sometimes they look like being dropped off with strangers. Sometimes they come wrapped in grief and confusion, but they're beginnings just the same. And that day on the Miller's porch with my shoes half untied and my throat too tight to speak was the beginning of a story I never expected to write. The story of how I stopped waiting for someone to rescue me and started learning how to stand on my own. But that lesson didn't happen overnight. In fact, it took years. And it really started the moment I realized kindness isn't always easy to accept, especially when you've been taught you don't deserve it. The Millers were kind, too kind maybe. They tried so hard to make me feel welcome. Mrs. Miller made pancakes shaped like bears every Saturday. Mr. Miller built me a bookshelf and filled it with books from his childhood. They never asked too many questions, never pushed too hard. But kindness when you've been hurt doesn't feel soft. It feels suspicious, like a gift you didn't ask for wrapped too neatly to be real. I remember one night just a few weeks after I moved in. Mrs. Miller had tucked me into bed and said, "You're safe here, Jenna." I nodded politely, but inside I thought safe until when? Because in my head, this wasn't home. It was a waiting room, a polite lavender-scented pause until my parents came back for me, until I could go back to the life I thought I belonged to. School didn't help. Kids noticed I was new and word spread fast. "That's the foster girl," someone whispered in the cafeteria. I laughed along, called myself Jenna from nowhere, like I was in on the joke. But I wasn't. I was just trying to control the story before someone else did. That year, during a group project, a boy named Caleb asked why I didn't have baby pictures for our family tree assignment. I shrugged and said I forgot them. But the truth was, I didn't know if my pictures were still in that house or if they'd already been tossed out to make room for Maxine's trophies and vacation souvenirs. Here's something they don't tell you about foster care. Even when you land somewhere safe, it still takes time for your heart to unpack. You can be surrounded by warmth and still feel cold. Because trust isn't built in pancakes and good intentions. It's built slowly through small, consistent acts over time. And in time, the Millers gave me that. But back then, I wasn't ready to accept it. I still clung to the idea that my parents might call, explain everything, and take me home. I didn't know that sometimes not calling is the answer. Sometimes silence is louder than words. But change, like healing, comes in quiet ways. It starts in the ordinary. A cup of hot cocoa left by your door. A gentle voice reminding you you're not in trouble. A book with your name on the inside cover, not borrowed but given. Still, I wasn't there yet. I smiled when I needed to. I said thank you when expected, but I kept a mental distance like I was a guest who might be asked to leave at any time. It wasn't until I saw a picture of my parents on a beach, laughing, sun-kissed and carefree, that something in me started to shift. Because that's when I realized while I was holding space for them in my heart, they weren't holding space for me in theirs. But that's part 3. Because first I needed to see it with my own eyes what they'd chosen instead of me. And I needed to ask myself the question no 12-year-old should ever have to ask. Was I that easy to forget? It happened on a Tuesday. I was sitting on the Millers' living room carpet, half-heartedly scrolling through my phone while pretending to do homework. I don't even remember what made me look them up, maybe curiosity, maybe hope, but there they were. My parents, smiling beneath palm trees, holding drinks with tiny umbrellas, their faces glowing with the kind of happiness I hadn't seen in years, and definitely not in our old house. I clicked on the photo, then the next, then the next. A whole grid of sunshine and smiles and captions like living our best life and no baggage, just blessings. Maxine was in almost every shot on boats at temples in matching outfits with mom. And me? It was like I'd been cropped out of the family, not a mention, not a memory, not even a trace. I didn't cry right away, I just stared. My body went still, but inside it felt like a balloon popping in slow motion. Because it wasn't just that they left. It was that they replaced me with sunsets and smoothies and a daughter they actually wanted. The hardest photo to look at was one of mom holding Maxine's hand on a stone staircase in Santorini. The caption read, "Our little miracle making every step of this journey worth it." That sentence broke something in me because I used to think I was a miracle too back when scraped knees were worth bandages and bedtime meant lullabies. That night I didn't tell the Millers. I just sat in my room with my phone face down and my heart hollow. It felt like grief, but not the kind you can name. More like the slow, heavy ache of becoming invisible to the people who were supposed to see you first. I wanted to scream at them. I wanted to comment on every photo, write paragraphs about what it's like to be deleted by your own parents. But I didn't. Because deep down, I knew the truth. They weren't thinking about me. And if they were, it wasn't enough to pause the party. What hit me harder than the photos was their blog. Yes, they had a travel blog, a sleek, shiny collection of stories about how letting go of attachments gave them peace. They didn't name me, but I knew I was one of those attachments. One paragraph actually said, "When we released what no longer served us, we found joy again." I was 12. What about me could have possibly not served them? That question clung to me for weeks. It followed me into classrooms and across dinner tables. It haunted me during the quiet parts of the day and even louder in the dark. And for the first time, I stopped waiting for their call, not because I gave up, but because I finally understood it was never coming. And here's the thing, sometimes heartbreak doesn't come with slamming doors or screaming matches. Sometimes it arrives quietly through curated posts and filtered photos. And when it does, the pain feels both too big to carry and too invisible to name. But something shifted in me that day. I didn't realize it yet, but I had reached the edge of hoping, and on the other side of that edge was clarity. It would take one more moment, one more discovery, to snap the illusion completely. And that moment came in the form of an envelope. But we'll get there. First, I had to learn that when people erase you from their story, the most powerful thing you can do is begin writing your own. It started with a knock on my door and a cardboard box. Emma, my younger sister, the one who used to ride on mom's shoulders while I walked behind, stood on the porch holding it, like it weighed more than it should have. "You need to see this," she said, her voice low. We hadn't seen much of each other over the years, but something about the look in her eyes told me this wasn't just a visit. We sat at the kitchen table while she opened the box. Inside were old documents, loose photos, and a folder marked in fading ink, household, private. I braced myself. What I expected were old tax forms, maybe family records. What I didn't expect were pages and pages of unpaid bills, letters from collection agencies and foreclosure warnings dating back to the year they left me. At the bottom of the pile was a legal letter from a financial advisor. It was full of dry language about liability reduction and streamlining household expenses. But what chilled me was that my name appeared on page 2 listed as a dependent cost that had been factored out of their new financial plan. In black and white, I saw the truth. I hadn't been left behind out of love or even desperation. I had been calculated out, like a spreadsheet adjustment. Emma looked at me unsure of what to say. I didn't know she whispered. I thought they just couldn't handle things. I nodded, unable to speak. Because in that moment, I wasn't thinking about numbers or documents. I was thinking about the last hug Mom gave me and how it suddenly felt less like love and more like clearance. We sat in silence, the folder between us like a crack in the table that couldn't be repaired. And maybe that was the worst part, not the betrayal, but the realization that it had been strategic, that I was never part of their escape plan. I was part of their debt. What that folder taught me was something I never wanted to learn, that not all abandonment is emotional. Sometimes it's transactional. Sometimes you're not left because you're broken, but because someone else is calculating what they think they can survive without. It took me weeks to process it. I carried that folder around like a splinter under the skin, too deep to pull, too painful to ignore. But something strange started to happen. The more I faced the truth, the less power it had over me. The myth I'd built that they just didn't know how to love me right was gone. In its place was something harder, but more honest. And honestly, that's when I started to heal. Because once the illusion falls, what's left is yours to build. No more waiting for an apology. No more rewriting the past. Just truth and the space it creates for something new. And for me, that new came in the form of small choices, a job, a club, a friend. Brick by brick, I started building a life outside of their shadow. But I wasn't done yet, not even close, because the next part of my journey wasn't just about healing. It was about growth, stepping into the world with both hands open and saying, I'm not who you left, I'm who I became. After the folder, something in me shifted. The grief didn't disappear, but it got quieter. Like background noise I could finally think over. I stopped replaying old memories for answers and started asking new questions. Like, what kind of life do I want if no one's going to hand it to me? What started as survival slowly became something else. Not just healing, but becoming. The first step, getting out of my own way. I joined the debate team not because I was good at arguing, though I'd had years of experience defending myself silently, but because Mr. Miller said I had a voice worth using. I didn't believe him at first, but I still showed up. And little by little, I got better. Not just at speaking, but at standing, holding eye contact, saying I disagree without apologizing. Then came my part-time job at a tiny local bookstore with creaky floors and a cat named Hemingway who hated everyone but me. I shelved novels, rang up customers, and for the first time earned money that was mine. With each paycheck, I bought something small, a new hoodie, a coffee for a friend, a tiny cactus that sat on my nightstand like proof that I could keep something alive. No one handed me a plan. The Millers offered support, not answers. But that was the gift. I learned to chart my own course. Slowly, I built habits, routines, safety. Not the kind my old life promised, but the kind I could trust. I even started tutoring younger students after school, helping them through math and science. And you know what? I was good at it. Not because I was the smartest, but because I understood what it felt like to need someone to explain things gently, with patience, and without judgment. One afternoon, while helping a kid named Damien work through a word problem, he looked up and said, "You're really nice. Are you a teacher or something?" I smiled and said, "Not yet." But something about the way he asked it stuck. That night, I wrote in my journal just one sentence. What if I built something that made it easier for kids like me? It wasn't a business plan. It wasn't even a goal, just a seed. Here's what I learned. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is believe in your own capacity. Not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. Because when the world tries to shrink you, the most powerful response is expansion. And slowly, I was expanding into spaces I didn't think I deserved, into opportunities I never imagined I could claim. It wasn't flashy. It was quiet, steady work, but it was mine. Still, I had no idea just how much I was growing until graduation came around. A milestone, a moment, and the day they tried to take it from me. But I wasn't that girl with the duffel bag anymore. And in part 6, you'll see exactly what happened when they showed up uninvited and expected to take credit for the life they once walked away from. Graduation day was warm with just enough breeze to make the ceremony programs flutter like little flags. My gown felt oversized and a little stiff, but I loved it. Mrs. Miller had ironed it the night before and left a sticky note on my door that read, "So proud of you, sweetheart. We'll be cheering the loudest." That morning, I walked out of the house not as a guest in someone else's life, but as someone finally owning hers. Everything felt right. Ryan, my best friend, cracked jokes about tripping on stage. Mr. Miller kept adjusting his tie like he was the one graduating. And Emma? Yes. Emma stood near the back, smiling, holding a bouquet of sunflowers that she said looked like resilience. I had no idea they were coming. Not the Millers, my parents. I saw them just after my name was called. As I stepped off the stage, diploma in hand, they appeared like a mirage at the edge of the crowd. My stomach dropped. My breath caught. There they were. Mom, in a white linen dress. Dad in sunglasses, both dressed like they were late to brunch, not a daughter's milestone. Their smiles didn't match the moment. Too wide, too rehearsed. They pushed through the crowd with practiced ease. "Jenna," my mother said, her voice syrupy sweet. "You look so grown up." My father clapped me on the shoulder like we were colleagues who hadn't seen each other in years. "We're so proud of you, kiddo," he said. "We wouldn't miss this for the world." I looked at them stunned. My throat tightened. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask how many birthdays they'd missed, how many report cards they'd ignored, how many nights I waited for a phone call that never came. But all I said was, "Why are you here?" "We're family," my mom answered like it was obvious. But family doesn't forget. Family doesn't delete you from the narrative and then try to show up for the final chapter. Emma stepped in beside me. "No," she said sharply, looking them in the eye for the first time in years. "You don't get to ruin this for her." My parents stood frozen for a second, then exchanged glances. The smiles dropped. My dad muttered something about not making a scene, and my mother said we just wanted to support her. But support isn't seasonal. It's not something you offer when there's an audience. It's what shows up when no one's watching. They left quickly after that, disappearing just as suddenly as they'd come. No apology, no acknowledgement of what they'd done or not done. Back at the Miller's house, the backyard was strung with fairy lights, and the table overflowed with barbecue and lemonade. We laughed, took blurry photos, and passed around my diploma like it was a trophy we'd all won together. Because in a way, we had. Later that night, Emma and I sat under the stars. She handed me a tiny envelope. "Open it when you're ready," she said. Inside was a note that read, "You didn't just graduate, Jenna. You reclaimed your story." And I think that's what that day really meant. Not just an ending, but a turning point. A moment I stood tall, looked the past in the face, and chose not to invite it forward. But as I'd soon learn, they weren't done. Because a week later, an email arrived in my inbox, and with it, a whole new chapter, one I never asked for, and one that would test just how far I'd come. The email showed up a week after graduation. Subject line, "We're reaching out from the heart." The sender was Laura Bennett, but I didn't need to open it to know who it was from. My mother, the same woman who hadn't sent a single birthday card in over a decade. I stared at it for a long time before I clicked. It wasn't short. She wrote about how hard things had been for them lately, how the travel blog had failed, how debts had piled up. She said they'd made mistakes, but that they always loved me and were so proud of the woman I'd become. And then, like a pin slipping through silk, came the real reason we'd be so grateful if you could help us get through this rough patch. There it was, dressed in sentiment, wrapped in guilt, but still, the same old pattern: take what you need, vanish when it's inconvenient, return only when desperate. They didn't call when I got my first job. They didn't reach out when I published my first article or won that statewide scholarship. But now that I had something they wanted, suddenly they remembered I existed. I didn't reply. I deleted the email and blocked the address, but that didn't stop them. Soon after, distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years began messaging me. Aunt Renee said I was being cold. Uncle Paul said, "They're still your parents, Jenna." I even got a phone call from my old music teacher who said she'd received a message from my father through LinkedIn. They were trying to reach me through my entire network, like roots, trying to force their way into foundations I'd built without them. And worst of all, they reached out to my boss. "Jenna, I'm not trying to get in your business," my manager said gently, pulling me aside one afternoon. but someone claiming to be your mother emailed the store. It was strange. I felt my stomach drop. My world, this life I'd constructed from scraps and effort and long nights of self-doubt, was being poked, prodded, tested by the very people who'd once discarded me. And this time, they weren't just coming for my forgiveness. They were trying to rewrite the story. But I had learned something powerful by then. People don't just change because they fall. Sometimes they just fall harder into the habits that broke them, and calling it love doesn't make it so. When someone shows you who they are, not once but over and over, you stop waiting for an apology and start building boundaries. Emma was the one who finally said it out loud. This isn't a cry for help, she told me over the phone. It's control. It always has been. And she was right. They weren't reaching out because they wanted to rebuild a relationship. They were trying to cash in on a connection they'd never earned. I didn't owe them anything, not money, not closure, not the comfort of pretending we were ever okay. But I also knew this wasn't the end. Because some people, when the door stays closed, look for a window, and I had no idea what they'd try next. What I did know deeply quietly without question was that I was ready for it. Because the next chapter wouldn't be about them chasing me. It would be about me stepping forward louder, bolder, and more visible than ever. By the time I turned 21, something strange had started happening. People began listening. It started small. An online post I wrote about aging out of foster care went semi-viral. Not because it was clever or polished, but because it was honest. I shared how hard it was to figure out taxes alone, how no one ever taught me how to open a bank account or read a lease, how I once cried in a grocery store because I didn't know which milk to buy and didn't want to look stupid asking. The comments flooded in. Some were from other former foster youth who said same. Others were from parents, teachers, even social workers, who admitted they'd never thought about those details. That post became a conversation, and that conversation turned into something more, a platform I didn't know I was building. I called it Next Step. It started as a blog, then a YouTube channel, then a nonprofit. I partnered with local schools and shelters to run workshops on basic life skills, everything from budgeting to conflict resolution. I wasn't an expert in the traditional sense, but I was someone who had lived the gaps, fallen through the cracks, and learned to climb out anyway. When a small public radio station asked to interview me, I nearly said no. I was still getting used to the idea that my voice mattered, but I remembered what it felt like to be 12 and invisible. So I said yes for her. That interview opened new doors. A producer from a documentary series about resilience reached out. They were filming a piece on young changemakers and asked if I'd be willing to share my story. This time, I didn't hesitate. Filming was both healing and hard. They asked about everything my childhood, the Millers, the silence, the folder, the emails, and yes, about my parents. I was careful. I didn't speak to hurt them, but I didn't protect them either. They made their choices, I said in one scene. And so did I. My life now, it's mine. It's not built on anger. It's built on truth. The night the documentary aired, I stayed up late reading the responses. Messages poured in from people across the country, teens, adults, strangers who said I saw myself in your story. A girl named Ava from Minnesota wrote, I thought no one else knew what it felt like to be left. Thank you for making me feel less alone. That one message worth everything, but not everyone was happy. As expected, my parents tried to fight back. They posted vague, emotional rants on social media about being misunderstood about their side of the story. They claimed I was ungrateful, that I was rewriting history. But the truth, it didn't matter anymore. Because I had spent years trying to be quiet enough, good enough, forgettable enough to earn their love. And now I was done being silent. I wasn't speaking out of bitterness. I was speaking for the kids who were still waiting for someone to see them. I was speaking for 12-year-old Jenna and for the girls like Ava who needed proof that survival wasn't the end of the story, thriving was possible too. That was the moment I realized something profound. They could twist their narrative all they wanted, but they couldn't silence mine. Not anymore. Still, even as I stood taller than ever, I wasn't immune to fear, because some ghosts don't haunt you from behind, they show up at your doorstep. And in part 9, they did exactly that. It happened on a Sunday morning. The kind of quiet morning where the light spills softly through the curtains, and you let yourself believe just for a moment that peace is permanent. I was watering my windowsill plants when I heard a knock at the door. Not frantic, not timid, just expectant. I wasn't expecting anyone. I glanced through the peephole and my breath caught. It was them, my parents, standing on my porch. My mother wore a wrinkled cardigan, her hair pulled back, in a way that tried too hard to look casual. My father looked thinner than I remembered, holding a folder tucked under his arm like a peace offering. I didn't open the door. I stepped back, heart pounding, mind racing. And for a brief second, the 12-year-old in me stirred hopeful aching, wondering if maybe, just maybe, this was the moment they'd say everything I needed to hear. But then I remembered every unanswered question. Every night I stared at a ceiling waiting for a call that never came. I remembered the folder with my name listed like a liability, the email asking for money disguised as love, the comments that painted me as the villain of my own story. And I knew I didn't need their words. I had already written the ending. They knocked again. I didn't move. Eventually, they left a letter at the doorstep and walked away without looking back. I let it sit there for a full day before I picked it up. I didn't read it. I threw it away. Emma called me that evening. "They showed up at my place last week too," she said quietly, begging me to talk to you. I told them no. I told them you owe them nothing. That call meant more than she knew. For so long, I thought closure had to come with a conversation, a confrontation, a final chapter where everyone said their piece. But sometimes closure is a quiet refusal, a locked door, a voice that says, "I choose peace over permission." Here's what I learned. Forgiveness isn't always about the other person. It's about freeing yourself from the expectation that they'll become someone they're not. It's about knowing you can love yourself enough to walk away, even if they show up crying. And I did walk away, not physically, but emotionally, fully, completely. That day wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no tears, just sunlight, a locked door, and the deep, unshakable calm of knowing I didn't need them to heal. But something else came after. Not from them, but from the life I had built in their absence. Because in part 10, I'll show you what real family looks like and how home, after all these years, finally found me. My first house wasn't big. A little 2-bedroom with creaky floors and a front porch that needed paint. But the moment I stepped inside, keys in hand, I felt something I'd never fully felt before. Not just safety, but belonging. It was mine. Every wall, every chipped tile, every quiet corner. And more than that, it was the life I had built from the pieces no one thought would matter. I invited the Millers over for dinner the first weekend after I moved in. Mr. Miller brought lemonade in a mason jar like he always did, and Mrs. Miller cried when she saw the framed photo of us all at my high school graduation, hanging by the stairs. "You've made a home," she whispered. And I had, with hand-me-down chairs, thrifted plates, and laughter that filled the gaps. Emma came to sunflower bouquet in hand. We sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, and for the first time we talked about everything. The leaving, the silence, the reckoning. She told me she was proud of me, not because I succeeded, but because I never let bitterness become my identity. And I told her she was brave for seeing the truth and choosing peace. That night, as we clinked glasses and passed dishes around a crowded kitchen table, I realized something I wish 12-year-old me had known. Family isn't who you're born to. It's who stays. It's who roots for you, quietly celebrates loudly, and reminds you that you're more than what was taken from you. The life I have now is simple, but it's full. I run Next Step full-time, and we've expanded to serve teens in 4 states. Our volunteers, many of whom were once students, now lead sessions of their own. I still get letters from kids like Ava who say the program helped them find their footing. Every single one reminds me why I keep going. I don't hate my parents. That's the surprising part. I don't wish them harm. I just don't center them anymore. They're no longer the shadow I live under. They're just part of the backstory, the prologue. Because this is the story I choose to tell now, a girl left behind, who learned how to hold her own hand, who stopped waiting for the apology, who built something better, who forgave not to welcome them back, but to release herself forward. If you're watching this, and you've ever been made to feel unwanted, please hear this. You are not the mistake someone else made. You are the story you choose to write next. And if you don't feel ready yet, that's okay. Just start small, water a plant, join a club, say yes to something that scares you a little. Because healing doesn't arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives quietly, with creaky floors, with mismatched plates, with people who see you and stay. That's what home feels like. That's what family becomes. And that's the life I built. If this story resonated with you, even just one part of it, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from, or tell me what part of your story you're still writing. And if you know someone who needs to hear that it's okay to start over, feel free to share this video with them. You never know whose life it might touch. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more real stories about resilience, healing, and finding your own way forward. Until next time, take care of your heart. You deserve to feel seen,